All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we are live. We'll give it a moment here for people to sort of tune in, respond to that Facebook notification. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the First Tuesday Conservatives weekly Zoom call. Thank you so much for tuning in for us. In just a moment, we're going to speak with John Phelan, an economist that works with the Center of the American Experiment. But before that, we have an important announcement. Starting very soon, we're going to begin a second show, the Countdown to November 3rd. As we all know, the election is of absolute importance, and it's critical that we hear strong conservative voices discussing the issues and helping us get our message out as it comes time to vote. Some of the guests for that show will be Abby Johnson. You might know that name from the movie Unplanned, the dramatic true story about the truth behind Planned Parenthood. We'll also have Friar Altman back. We know that we had a very positive reception when he was on the show. And we have a few more guests coming up that we'll discuss at the end of this interview. But now I want to introduce John Phelan, an economist who's been writing with the Center of the American Experiment and for their magazine, Thinking Minnesota. He's been pontificating deeply about the coronavirus and the riots and their effects on Minnesota, and we're so glad to have him. John, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. As Kyle says, I'm an economist. I work at the Center of the American Experiment. We're a think tank based in Golden Valley. And we kind of research and write on a range of issues. We have particular policy expertise in the economy, which is my area, education, and also energy policy. We have individual people working in those, and we do various things. We research and write papers. We then take these papers and turn them into various different outputs. So we will use them as the basis for op-eds in newspapers, and we do quite well in placing those. But also, we're quite kind of activists in the sense that we put out as well billboards. You may have seen some of our billboards around town recently. We do kind of spin-off campaigns like Support Police, which is one that we have running at the moment, where we campaign against some of the wacky ideas like defunding the police, which unfortunately has become popular in the wake of recent events. Now, those kind of recent events are why I'm here today. I wrote an article in Thinking Minnesota, which is a magazine, a quarterly magazine that we produce. You can receive it for free, actually. If you go onto our website, you can register and we will send you that paper copy. You can also sign other people up for it as well, if you're feeling generous. What I do is I co-wrote with my colleague Tom Stewart in the most recent one, an article looking at the state and city government in Minneapolis, particularly their response to the riots in the aftermath of George Floyd's death on Memorial Day. It's actually it was one part of a two-header. We had another article that was also about the state government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in the state. And together, I think the two articles make a fairly, damning indictment of just what a shambles actually state government in Minnesota actually is. I don't intend to recount at any great length what's in my article about, the course of the riots. What I did is put together a kind of timeline because I generally find that the best way to convince people is just to lay out the facts. And so that's what me and Tom did in this article. And we take you through day by day from the death of George Floyd on Memorial Day through to the kind of damping down of the riots that there was on Saturday, so that the Saturday passed fairly peacefully. That was May the 30th, I believe. And what I think is crucial about this, you can go and read the article, it's online, you can read the whole thing in full. But what's interesting is the stuff that's come out since, stuff that wasn't known at the time that we wrote this. But there will be an article on this in the forthcoming magazine. Now, the riots kind of finished or ended quite quickly. From the early hours of Saturday, and we had a very peaceful Saturday, despite the best efforts of people like Ryan Winkler to try and get a mob together to beat a truck driver to death. We had a peaceful Saturday, a relatively peaceful Saturday, and that originated when the National Guard, Minnesota National Guard, were deployed in strength. Now, this was after there had been riots for 4 consecutive nights. And particularly, you may remember that the 4th precinct was abandoned and left to the mob. and it was burnt down. And it was after that we were told on the Friday morning, when Governor Walz took over, he gave this press conference on a Friday morning, and he sounded, all kind of Churchillian. He said, "You're not going to see that You're not going to see that tonight. That's off the table. The state's stepping in and taking over." And he imposed this curfew. But then when the evening came, it turned out that there was nobody around to impose this curfew. It was just kind of a thing, it was like the mask mandate on Metro Transit.
I was there. I was out
enforces it.
past the curfew. There was no enforcement. I saw
No,
it.
none
Yeah.
whatsoever. And so everything just kind of carried on like it had been.
Mhm.
There were riots, there was destruction, there was violence. People had their livelihoods wrecked on a night when Governor Walz had promised that we won't see that again. And it's actually, if you look at a failed state, we've had a lot of discussion about failed states in the last 20 or 30 years, but it's interesting. A failed state is kind of defined as one where the writ of the government doesn't run anymore. The government can't impose its will on people. And for a while, actually, for a few days at the end of May this year, Minnesota met that criteria. Minnesota was a failed state under Governor Walz. And that's kind of, a terrible thing to think about, really.
Yeah.
And I think, so if you look at the situation, with the National Guard, they were brought in the early hours of Saturday, and they ended things fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And so you have to ask yourself, and when the Republicans held these hearings in the Senate up in the state capitol in July, this was, they called in the general of the Minnesota National Guard, and they said to him, do you think that in an earlier deployment of the National Guard would have quietened things down earlier? And he said, absolutely, yes, there's no doubt about it. And if you look actually now what's happening in Wisconsin, it does seem that Governor Evers has learned something, at least, from all this. He's not wasted any time in getting the National Guard on the streets of Kenosha, probably because he's seen what happened in the Twin Cities, when you just think, hey, it'll burn itself out.
Right.
So the question, I think, has to be asked: why is it that the Minnesota National Guard was so late in being deployed? Now, the article that we wrote, knowing what we knew at the time, kind of pinned the blame on Mayor Fry, Jacob Fry, Mayor of Minneapolis, for not calling the National Guard in and for not issuing the instructions. When Governor Walz gave his press conference, in which he struck his kind of bellicose tone, he actually threw Fry under the bus completely. It was a quite striking thing to see. He said abject failure, failure of leadership, completely useless, and all the rest of it. But now there was a Freedom of Information Act a request submitted. They asked for texts and emails between City of Minneapolis officials, and the speed with which this was granted and these things were released is suspiciously fast. I mean, it suggests to me that somebody wanted these things out, and they wanted this story out there. So what you see actually is that this tells a very different story. You now see that Jacob Fry actually requested the National Guard fairly early, and that the chief of the Minneapolis police had put together a plan, and they sent this off to the state government, to Governor Walz, to the authorities, and to Commissioner Harrington, and they said, we need the National Guard coming in, and here's our plan. And they didn't get a response, and they were kind of fobbed off. And Governor Walz, when he was asked about this, he said, well, you don't just submit a plan, you have to, submit like a super plan or something,
Sure.
like he was planning D-Day or something like that. And then he made this bizarre statement that, when I'm paraphrasing here, that when you call in the National Guard, you think you're getting trained soldiers, and actual fact, you're getting 19-year-old cooks.
I remember that.
That's absolutely incredible. The National Guard, Minnesota National Guard, they've been deployed in Iraq.
Yeah. They're soldiers.
Yeah, and they go through training for this every year for civil disturbances. So this is completely untrue. It's just a bald-faced lie from a guy who was actually a member of the National Guard, and never lets you forget that fact, despite the fact that he got out of it pretty sharpish when they were on their way to Iraq.
Yeah, he did.
Indeed, I mean, he was tweeting the other day about his service in Italy during the Afghan war. I mean, I can't imagine that was too bad of a posting. But it's, so it's interesting. It seems that things have changed, and there is this breakdown of, of government, it seems to me, this buck passing. And you always come back to the question, because at the time of the riots, people were saying, well, I mean, Governor Walz came out and said, we couldn't have predicted this. We couldn't have foreseen, this huge number of people getting involved in all this. And so the suggestion there seems to be that they couldn't do anything to stop this. But the other alternative is they wouldn't do what it took to stop this. And I think there's actually some truth in that, because there's an awful lot of sympathy, I believe, in the administration at the city and state level for these rioters. I mean, if you look, we've got an attorney general who tweets pictures of themselves with the Antifa cookbook.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a domestic terrorist organization. It should be. It's an absolutely loathsome group of, pseudo-fascists. And we've got the state attorney general thinks they're all right. And this breakdown between the city and the state authorities, we actually saw it during the riots as well. I collected a whole bunch of tweets that were going around during these events. And I was on the kind of really, really bad night of Friday, actually, when the National Guard was supposed to be there and they weren't. And it was all Minneapolis city councillors tweeting themselves, tweeting Fry, saying the National Guard is supposed to be here, the fire brigade is supposed to be, where are they? And nobody knew. So there's that aspect to it as well. I think on the one hand, one of the things that crippled the state's response was that there's too much sympathy among the state's leaders for these rioters. And secondly, there's just a basic lack of executive competence. These guys, at the end of the day, there is also the fact they're just incompetent. They're not very good at doing things.
Right.
And so I think, that's a worrying thing. And it's kind of funny to me, the local media, they just give people a pass on all this. I remember watching the press conference on the Saturday morning. So this is after there'd been this huge disaster on the Friday when we were supposed to get this strong response from the state, and it never materialized. And initially, Walz was out there being quizzed by the reporters, and they were giving him some tough questions. And then suddenly someone says, oh, I hear Jay-Z phoned you up last night. And they all started laughing. And it was all back to the usual backslapping that there is between Minnesota media and politics. It's this really kind of little closed circle. And as I've said to people before, I come from Britain, which has a very different press culture to Minnesota. The British media are a kind of pack of rabid hounds who spend their entire time trying to get some minister or shadow minister sacked.
Yeah.
And to come here and see how things are in this state, where much of the media, Alpha News being a very noble exception, they seem to see it as their job to defend the politicians here, to run interference for them. And you see that time and time again. So yeah, I think overall, when we look at the riots, what you see is this, basic issue. You see a basic issue of competence and a basic issue that we have state government who's too much in sympathy with these lawbreakers. And just as a final point before we go on to a discussion about this, the rioters get much more leeway than anybody else would get.
Yes.
So, for example, George Floyd's memorial service, Governor Walz attended it. That memorial service was in breach of his own guidelines. Now, anybody who went to who had a loved one die during that period, they were not allowed to grieve as they would have wished because of these laws which the governor wrote and laws which the governor exempted himself from.
Yeah.
So not only does he get to write these laws, he gets to exempt himself from them as well. And also, if you look at people, I mean, we've now got this fashion, it seems now, for blocking freeways around the town. Whether it's for anything to do with Minnesota or America even, who knows? But we've now got these freeways being blocked. It's a federal crime, but it's never enforced. The Columbus statute gets pulled down. They warn people that they're going to do it. The police could turn up and pick these people up with a pair of tweezers, and where are they? And yet, if you're a guy in Albany, Minnesota, who tries to open his bar, you get a letter from the attorney general. We're going to be down on you like a ton of bricks. If you're a guy who owns a rodeo in northern Minnesota, bang, you get a letter from the attorney general. We're down on you like a ton of bricks. So Governor Walz likes to talk a lot about one Minnesota, but that's all it is. It's a slogan. There's actually two very different and distinct Minnesotas here. There's a Minnesota that is subject to the law and to a very large extent, it's rural Minnesota. And then there's a Minnesota where you can kind of do what you like. You know, if you've got some kind of spurious excuse or social justice cause, the law doesn't apply to you. The laws will not be applied to you, and that is a really, really dangerous place for the state to be.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, though, in Governor Walz's own words, rural Minnesota is only cows and rocks. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of care extended to the needs of that community.
Absolutely.
You present kind of a dark and damning assessment of Minnesota, especially the response to the riots. A lot to go on here, but what I have to ask, it seems like Governor Walz is blaming the failure on the lower levels of government, like Mayor Fry. Is that being reciprocated by Mayor Fry trying to pass the buck back to the state level?
Yeah, absolutely. He has come out and said quite clearly, you know, that when he sat watching the press conference where Walz threw the city government under the bus, that it was hard for people to watch. He said, you know, we've been working for days to try and keep a lid on this with no help and no support. And then we've got this guy running around, you know, bad mouthing us in front of all the media. And the strong insinuation there is that, you know, Walz was just ditching these people to cover himself. I mean, Fry is quite clear that they wanted the National Guard in earlier.
Yeah.
And that they didn't get the National Guard in earlier when they wanted them because there were delays at the state government level.
In your assessment, is it possible that this is truly just a problem of bureaucracy, that the state is slow to respond because of how it's set up? We're not equipped to deal with the riots, and it's difficult to put these actions, you know, into progress? Or can we be fairly convinced that there is actually foul play afoot?
I think there's actually just I think that, like I said, I think there's two things. I think on the one hand, you do have this aspect that there's an awful lot of people in the city and state governments who sympathize with these folks. You could not get any kind of condemnation for these riots that wasn't prefaced by some remark about, you know, 400 years of racism or something. Everything had to be prefaced with that. You know, it's, you know, 400 years of racism, that's very, very bad, and you shouldn't burn down AutoZone, which is kind of, you know, muddies the message a little bit. And at the same time, you had Fry. I mean, I don't say any of this to exonerate Jacob Fry. He was giving incredible press conferences, which were just kind of emotional outpourings. And you had community leaders actually saying, look, we don't need this. We need people to calm things down. And you've got this guy, you know, practically sobbing at one of his press conferences. I think it was the Tuesday, it was the Wednesday, actually. And he's practically sobbing at this thing. I mean, this is not leadership.
No,
I mean, you know, it actually pours fuel on the flames of these things. But like I say, also there is a big aspect of just sheer incompetence, which I think, you know, you can't discount.
And worse than that, he's giving these emotionally incompetent press conferences, and then he shows up to a rally. I forget which day it is. He shows up to a rally, is invited to speak at the Bullhorn, and then gets booed out of a 1,000-person rally at his own city. It was not a proud moment for the leader of Minneapolis at all.
I think one thing that should teach is that you can't bargain with these people.
Right.
You know, there's too much of an idea that, you know, and I see this on social media, you know, well-meaning people, they will, you know, they'll tweet things, Black Lives Matter or whatever, and hashtag, you know, and they think I'm doing my bit, you know, I'm being a good person. But, you know, and they think I can do this, but I can frown on all the rest of it. But, you know, once you go a little way with these people, they will drag you the rest of the way.
Absolutely.
And I give you an example actually from local sports. I remember a big outcry that there was about Colin Kaepernick.
Yep.
Colin Kaepernick wanted to kneel for the national anthem. For me, that's a question between him and his employer. If his employer's fine for him to do that on their time, then that's great. But he, you know, so he can have that discussion with his bosses at the 49ers, as it was at the time. Now, just recently, the Minnesota United, the soccer team here, they had this whole thing. They had this weird tournament down in Florida. And they had this whole situation where, you know, everyone was kind of kneeling and fists up before the games, apart from one guy, Brett Coleman, who's one of their centre halves. And he's actually a guy from Woodbury, he's a local boy. And he just wore his t-shirt didn't say Black Lives Matter. He just wore a t-shirt that said End Racism. And he stood up, he didn't kneel during the national anthem. He kind of stood with his hands behind his back and his head bowed in a very respectful way. But if you went on social media, there was an outcry. Why is this guy not doing this? Why is this guy not doing, you know, not saying Black Lives Matter? Why is he not protesting? And I thought, well, hang on. If Kaepernick's got the right to protest, which you all seem to think he has, then this guy has the right not to. But and you see this now, the culminating of these people outside restaurants in Washington, D.C. This whole nefarious idea, silence is violence and silence is complicity. Silence isn't complicity. It might just be that I've got other things going on, and you have no right to draft me into your crusade or anybody else.
Yeah, not to get too editorial here, but I think that's one of the big misunderstandings between the left and the right. The right tries to engage in these sort of long form rhetorical debates about the philosophy of what's going on, and the left simply goes out, does things, and demands that you comply with them. And it's presented a big problem in the state. The next thing I kind of want to ask you about is the economic impact of all this. Of course, that's your field of study. Do you see a quick path to economic recovery for Minneapolis and the state more broadly? And what are we going to be looking at moving out from these riots?
Well, one of the things about this is that Minneapolis was already showing some warning signs before the riots. It's a kind of the regulatory policy in Minneapolis is a bad one. It's enacted this ridiculous $15 an hour minimum wage, which is supposed to come in sometime in the next couple of years. They're working their way up towards that. And I was writing stories on our website, last year and the year before about businesses getting out of downtown. I first visited Minneapolis in 2007, early 2007. And I remember the downtown, it was kind of all right. It wasn't like London, but it was all right. I moved over here in 2017 to 10 years later, and it was very different. And I go down there now, and it's just a ghost town. And this is before COVID, by the way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of problems in a place like Minneapolis, aside from COVID, aside from the riots. They're already there. And these are things of kind of bad regulatory policy at the city level. And these are only going to impede any kind of, bounce back that you see. So if you've got, $15 an hour minimum wage plus, your customers could get beaten up or mugged or something, then it makes things more difficult for you than if you just have to worry about your customers getting beaten up and being mugged. These things are kind of multiplicative. So it becomes very difficult. So I think, there are obvious things that I've written about at great length that Minneapolis would need to do, that the state would need to do actually to boost economic growth in the state, which does lag the national average. And these things have only really become more pertinent following these twin blows of COVID and the riots now.
Yeah. Speaking of coronavirus, what are your thoughts on the economic, implications of all of that? Because we saw that the state's not very good at crafting, responses to the riots. How do you assess their response to the virus?
I think it's been an absolute disaster. It's based on this kind of lunatic computer model, which does now seem to have been abandoned. It was last updated in mid-May, I think, or mid-April. I can't remember now which, but it's not been updated for a while. There was a story in the Star Tribune sometime in June about they're going to update the model soon, and it's not been updated since. And I think probably they've abandoned it. Now, this model predicted all these many deaths. It predicted a peak ICU usage of about 3,700 people in ICU with COVID-19. Now, the peak was actually something like 300. It was well below. They projected at one point, I think it was in mid-May, that by the end of May there would be 1,400 COVID-19 deaths. In actual fact, there were like 1,200, which might not sound like a huge difference, but if you're at the start of a kind of exponential curve, that small difference becomes a very big difference very quickly. I actually got just about spot on. I did my own forecast the same day that their forecast came out, and I did it just by taking the average number of deaths of the previous 18 days and forecasting it out to the end of the month. And I was out by like 5, and they were out by 200. Now, I'm not saying that I'm some master epidemiologist, but I've got a better record of prediction than they have. And we've shut down the entire state's economy based on this. Now, there is some aspect to which COVID-19 would damage the economy anyway. So even Sweden, for example, which is the poster boy for not locking things down, they've taken a huge hit in terms of their GDP as well. But then at the same time, they haven't offset the GDP fall with massive government spending. So to some extent, their stark fall would be less stuck if they'd done the things that everybody else has done. I mean, you know, we've got the debt problem that now that they don't have, and the UK's got the same situation. And so there is some aspect to this which would be a problem anyway. And you see that the mobility in the state decreased quite sharply before the stay-at-home order went into effect. People had stopped moving around before that because they were generally concerned about this weird virus. They'd all seen the videos of Italy or China or somewhere. But at the same time, you also see that people started moving around again before the lockdown ended. So you can argue to some extent that these lockdown orders have a, you know, they're not the big driver of economic outcomes that you see. But over time, that changes. Over time, they will become the driver. And so the initial sharp fall of GDP that you see, and you know, the initial recovery, that may not be driven entirely by lockdowns, but the shape of that slope, whether it's that or whether it's that, that will be driven by state government policy. And at the moment, we've got these knobs and dials that apparently they twiddle with, and no one can really figure out what the idea is behind any of that.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that an economic hit is basically inevitable with a pandemic like this, but it's the rate at which we recover and the rate at which we fall that's determined by the state policy.
Absolutely. I mean, we can now look at the situation and say that I think as of today, we've got something like, 2,000 ICU beds in the state available at 72 hours notice. We've got 1,000 ICU. These are rough numbers. We've got 1,000 beds in use, of which something like 150 of them are being used by COVID-19 patients. You know, so we've got cases have kind of surged since mid-July, but that's mostly because young people have been catching COVID. Young people don't go to the hospital with it; it doesn't affect them so much. So, in actual fact, though we've had this surge in cases since mid-June, we have not seen a surge in hospitalizations, which have flatlined all this month around 150 people in ICU. We have not seen a surge in deaths. We have had since early July 1 day with double-figure deaths. So the emergency portion of this pandemic is over. We do not need a further lockdown, as Neil Kashkari of the Minneapolis Fed said recently. And we do not need a continuation of the emergency measures that Governor Walz has appropriated for himself.
And I think speaking to your point earlier about how the Minnesota media fails to hold these people accountable, I haven't seen any reporting on that. No one's highlighting how even though cases have gone up, hospital utilization is not. One thing that I've been meaning to ask an economist for a while is, what do you think the impacts of various stimulus packages or programs were on the economy? Because I know that a lot of people had more spending money in their pocket as they were getting checks and this kind of thing. Do you think that is effective in boosting recovery, or it's just sort of short-term treatment?
It's a difficult thing because, what you're trying to do when you shut down the economy to fight a pandemic, you don't want to stimulate it. Quite the opposite. You're actually trying to freeze it. You're trying to kind of deep freeze the economy, and then you can thaw it out. And
just pause things where they're at, and then
So it's almost like you want to turn it off, and then later, like Keynes, for example, would talk about stalled economies having magneto trouble. And that the point of government spending was to get the motor going again. Now, if you're shutting down the economy to fight a pandemic, you don't want to do that. You're not actually trying to stimulate the economy. What you're trying to do is put money in people's hands so that they can tide themselves over. Has that been effective? To some extent, yeah. We have, but it's been a very blunt tool. So, for example, we had this $600 a week supplemental unemployment insurance that went through to people, which Democrats now, it can't possibly go down to $400 a week. What's special about $600 a week? There's nothing really. It was a number kind of plucked out of thin air. I think there has been some impact. The question is how you unwind that. So, to some extent, you can talk about we need to end this, these payments because, they're all out there, adding to the national debt. But at the same time, if we've still got our foot on the neck of the economy, it's kind of unfair to take someone's welfare away when you're still actually preventing them from getting jobs. It's a difficult thing for a free market guy, a small government guy to say. But if your next door neighbor smashes a baseball through your window, they replace the window, And in the
Yeah.
same way, if the government smashes your economy, smashes your business, smashes your job, it's up to the government to cover it. So
Yeah.
I don't actually necessarily have I mean, if this is a necessary thing, let's assume it is for a second, I don't have a problem with government going into that. But what they should do is really use the lockdown period to assess what do we need to do? How dangerous is this? Let's come up with a strategy.
Mhm.
Rather than just kind of bumbling along endlessly thinking, well, let's hope, a vaccine turns up, which might never happen.
True. We don't have a vaccine to the common cold. Viruses mutate all the time. Uh,
Yeah.
in your opinion, looking at the state economy, does it seem like there is sort of a developed plan, a developed approach moving forward, or is it truly as bumbling as it appears to the common sort of uneconomically educated person like me?
I think it's absolutely all over the place. If you look, for example, at St. Paul, Mayor Carter is going to take his CARES Act money
Yep.
and use it to fund some kind of weird extra welfare program for poor families. Now, that these poor families they could have been poor families before COVID.
Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
poverty might not be a function of the pandemic. So there are
Right.
people out there who have lost their jobs or whatever else because of the pandemic and because of the measures to fight the pandemic in St. Paul who aren't going to see any of this money because it's being used by the governor, by the mayor, just as another kind of welfare slush fund.
Very interesting. One topic that we like to touch on with all of our guests is the 2020 election. After Trump was elected in 2016, the economy, had a fantastic run. Things were going very well. What do you predict as the election draws near, if it's a Trump victory or if it's a Trump loss?
Uh, well, having lived through 2016, I don't think I'll ever make a prediction with confidence ever again.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing one thing I'd say is that my gut, I would put my money on Biden, but I won't put much on it.
Right, right.
Nothing would surprise me. And one thing I would say, speaking as an economist, is that the third quarter GDP figures are due out about 5 days before polling day, and they are going to show on current forecasts GDP growth of 25%. In the third quarter. We are at the moment actually living through the fastest quarter of recorded GDP growth in human history.
Interesting.
Now that number is going to come out. Now, obviously, that's 25% up from way down,
Right,
so it doesn't get
right.
you back to where you were. But that number is going to be out there. You're going to be able to say we're bouncing back, we're roaring back, and all the rest of it.
Mhm.
And then you can turn around very easily and say, do you want to take a risk on the Green New Deal, on $15 an hour federal minimum wage? And I think that's a powerful pitch. I'm not a political guy. If I was a GRP strategist, I would have all these ads ready to drop as soon as that number comes out.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing I've seen you write about and heard you talk about in the past is Minnesota's relationship to the rest of the nation economically, how our economy is composed versus how the nation's economy is composed. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, we are an unusual specimen in the sense that we are a fairly small state in terms of population, but we match the national economy in terms of the profile. So
Mhm.
the particular percentage shares of GDP for each industrial sector quite closely. A state like Iowa, for example, or South Dakota, that's not the case. They have very kind of lopsided ag sectors, very big ag
Right.
sectors. If you look at someone like Delaware, I think is a huge financial sector up there, much bigger than the kind of national thing. And you'd expect a big state like California or Texas to have that kind of diversified economy. You wouldn't necessarily expect a small state like ours to have it.
Hmm. So that's obviously an asset to state leaders, right? That should make economic regulation and economic growth easier to facilitate.
It should do, yeah, because it does mean. I mean, so for example, if you're the governor of Iowa, one of the things that you are going to have to think about is ag prices,
Right.
which commodity prices, which I mean nobody really understands a lot of those most of the time, and they
Mhm.
are certainly not something that the governor of Iowa can control.
Mhm.
So you've got this kind of huge exogenous thing a lot of the time. If you've got a more it's like a diversified investment portfolio. If
Sure.
you've got a more diverse economy, then a particular sectoral shock won't drag the whole thing down.
Okay.
You really do have to kind of worry about the big macro shocks.
So do you think state leaders are doing a proper job of capitalizing on the benefits that they would get from a diversified economy even before riots and COVID?
No, I don't. We have some of the highest taxes in the US.
Mhm.
We have some of the highest corporate taxes. Our corporate tax rate is about at the fourth highest in the country. Our personal income tax rate, the top rate is about the third or fourth highest in the country. But
Mhm.
even that, our lowest income tax rate is higher than the top rate in about 25, 26 states. So we don't just tax the rich here, we tax everybody here.
Yeah.
And you do see that in terms of population movements. You do see that we lag the national average in terms of capital per worker, in terms of investment capital, in terms of startups, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of employment in young businesses. And none of this is good for the future.
Mhm. So what would your recommendations be to state leaders from an economic perspective?
I think absolutely we need to cut tax rates. I don't believe actually that you will see a huge collapse in tax revenues. One of the interesting things is that if you draw a line
Mhm.
of state income or state tax revenues as a share of GDP, it's a pretty flat line going back however long you've got the data for, about 6.6% of GDP. Interestingly, when I've looked at the data for the UK or for the US, it's very similar. You see these flat lines no matter what tax policy is. So we have very high tax rates, much higher than we have now in Minnesota in the 1970s, and you were still getting that 6.6% of GDP in terms of government revenue. You had lower tax rates and you're still the same 6.6% of GDP. So I don't think that you're going to cut tax rates and see revenues collapse necessarily. Revenues are much more a function of GDP. So everybody should be on board, really. If you're a Democrat and you want more money to spend, then you should want GDP growth because that is a lot more linked to increases in revenues than rates.
Now, how does that work exactly? Because intuitively, it seems like you would cut taxes and then people would have more money to spend and businesses would succeed more. And then you'd actually end up pulling more tax money as businesses make more money, more taxable income. Is that sort of how it functions?
Well, one of the things is when you change tax rates, I mean, tax rates are incentives.
Sure.
That's why they hike taxes on cigarettes. It's to stop people smoking, and they're
Right.
completely explicit about that. You know, we're going to hike taxes on cigarettes. People stop smoking. Well, what do you think is going to happen if you hike taxes on capital investment? Any kind of investment or
People
labor.
will stop investing.
Exactly. And I
Gotcha.
think that what happens is when these rates go up, people kind of look at it and think, yeah, all right, I'm not paying you that. So it's almost like the government gets an allowance from the public.
Sure.
And so what happens is now, look, I'm not Rockefeller or Mark Dayton. If my taxes go up, there's only so many ways I can respond to that because
Mhm.
most of my income comes from wages. So there's not too much I can do, to lower my tax exposure if rates went up. But if
Mhm.
you're like earning more than me, if you're up there as an earner, then you have a
Mhm.
lot more options. And those people do pay a disproportionate share of tax revenues. So when they start to react, then that can make a big difference. And I think actually that explains a lot of it. Most people they just carry on chugging along, but all the action is at the top. It's always at the margin, as economists say.
Got it. Got it. So this really is not an every man's issue. Well, it is, but it's not every man that's having an impact on this kind of stuff. It's those big investors that are moving large amounts of money in and out of the state. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add, economically or otherwise, that we haven't gotten to touch on? I see that we're sort of coming down on time here. And if any of the viewers would like to enter a question in the chat, we'd be open to that as well.
Well, just to say, we do have a report coming out next month, as it is now, yeah, September, where
Mhm.
we because you get a lot of state-to-state comparisons, but it's very difficult to compare Minnesota's economy with South Dakota's because Minnesota's got the Twin Cities,
Yeah.
and there's a huge amount of evidence that having a big city is good for your economic growth. Now, Minnesota does not have the Twin Cities because Tim Walz and Martin Dayton had great policies.
Right.
Minnesota's had the Twin Cities and this huge population for 120 years now, or 140 years. So how do you kind of assess the impact of state government policies when you've got these exogenous factors? One way that you can remove those exogenous factors, and I got the idea from that book, Why Nations Fail, when a guy looks at Nogales, the bit north of the border and the bit south of the border, and he
Mhm.
says the only difference is which side of the border you're on. In terms
Yeah.
of the people, they're the same, the climate's the same, the germs are the same. And it's kind of the same when you look at the I-94 bridge. The only difference between, St. Croix County and Washington County is which side of the bridge you're on. So we use border county analysis to more precisely isolate the effects of government policy.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Any center events that our viewers should be aware of coming up? The Center of the American Experiment does fantastic work. If anybody's watching and they're not aware of the center, be sure to check them out. What do you guys have on the docket?
Well, we have a couple of things. The big one, I think, is I believe it's September the 19th. We have Sarah Huckabee Sanders doing our live gala. It's supposed to be like our annual dinner, but you can't really do that now.
Yeah.
Because I suggested we went and had it in Wisconsin.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, in the free state of Wisconsin. But no, we didn't do that. We decided to move the whole thing online. And so that I think is September 19th. So you can go online, register for that. It's a Zoom thing, I think, like this. And we've got watch parties registered all over the country for it. Actually, the Zoom thing is kind of funny because we've got like 50 people registered for a watch party in Massachusetts, and another 60 something registered in California. So
Yeah.
yeah, very very unusual, very different.
Blessing and a curse. I suppose you can expand your audience. Speaking of audience, if our audience wants to follow your work, where's the best place to do that?
I write daily at our website, americanexperiment.org. And you can also go on there and you can find the page for the magazine, Thinking Minnesota, and register yourself on there and you'll get sent a copy.
Absolutely, guys. Be sure to do that. Thinking Minnesota. It's a fantastic magazine. Their most recent issue was absolutely wonderful. They had good photographs and analysis of the situation in Minneapolis. John, thank you so much for being with us. Very wonderful discussion tonight.
It's been a pleasure.
And now, as promised, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit more about our new Countdown to November series. We mentioned that we're going to have James Altman back on, Friar James Altman. We mentioned that we're going to have Abby Johnson. We're also going to have Alice Marie Johnson, who is an advocate for criminal justice reform. This is something that's been getting a lot of traction in the media recently as we talk about police and policing and all these sorts of other issues. We're also going to have the director of the AJC, Transatlantic Institute for Global Jewish Advocacy from Brussels, calling in. That's going to be on September 29th at 10 a.m. One thing you'll notice, guys, as we pull closer to the election is that our countdown to November 3rd series will be at somewhat random times. We'll give you guys a little forewarning of that, but they'll be broadcast through the usual means on Facebook, but they will not be held at a regular interval like our first Tuesday conservative meetings will be. But do not fear, these meetings will continue at the same exact time. Thank you so much for tuning in for another week. Be sure to tune back in 7 days to see another show. Remember, our purpose is to inform, educate, and encourage conservatives to take action to stop the Democratic left from taking over Minnesota. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you again next week.